big thanks to the organizer in general of the conference and the university and the Paralimis Foundation. Actually, when you mentioned the name, indeed, I was reminded of Star Trek. Beyond the boundaries, to actually go where no one has gone before. You know, the beginning of Star Trek, well, I think we've already had a couple of examples of talks that were trying to go beyond the borders and the boundaries. Nice. So my talk, as a matter of fact, will be a more philosophical talk. And if you've looked at the title, it will be about several things. So consciousness, science, information, and then a strange animal called mysterianism. I'll tell you more about that in a second, of course. But let me just begin by introducing what the talk will be about. Now, Daniel Dennett, a well-known contemporary American philosopher, is credited with coining 3 different stances, as he called them, all useful in predicting the behavior of certain systems and objects. There are 3 that he mentions. Many of you will know them. The design stance, the physical stance, and there is another stance also, the intentional stance. So the design stance has it that one predicts the behavior of a system by assuming that it has a certain design, composed of certain elements with functions, and that will behave as it is designed to behave under certain circumstances. Then there's a physical stance, important stance, because there one predicts the behavior of physical systems by exploiting information about the physical constituents of the system and the laws of physics. Finally, according to Dennett, there is the intentional stance, in which the systems whose behavior one wants to predict are treated as rational agents. They are attributed the beliefs and desires they ought to have given their place in the world and their purpose. And subsequently, one predicts that they will act to further their goals in the light of their beliefs. Now, some philosophers have argued for an additional stance beyond the 3 that Dennett outlined. Some call it the phenomenal stance. Here, one argues about the attribution of consciousness, emotions, and inner experience to a mind. The problem, to which I will come back later, of the so-called explanatory gap, considered as a hard problem of consciousness to some, illustrates the tendency in this stance of people to see phenomenal experience as different from physical processes. My talk then consists of 4 parts. In the first part, I will try to show how in contemporary philosophy of mind and consciousness, the physical stance is the overarching paradigm. Here I will concentrate on the so-called problem of qualia, and with a digression also to language. More specifically, I will concentrate on the question of the existence of those qualia and their possible causal influence. In a second part, the reaction against this naturalistic approach of the physical stance will be discussed. It is here that mysterianism, so-called mysterianism, as a theory of mind, will be discussed further. Strangely enough, these mysterianist theories, it will turn out, are themselves, or claim themselves to be naturalistic theories, and so belong to the physical stance, but it will be shown that the naturalism proposed there is self-contradictory and misguided. Though, and that's why I will discuss it, though it may help us to pave the way for an approach which one might consider to belong to the phenomenal stance. The phenomenal stance will turn out to be a stance that does not suffer from the defect that can or could be attributed to mysterianism and is furthermore fully compatible with contemporary neurobiological approach. This stance will be discussed in a third part, and it will concentrate on such concepts as embodied information and certain logical, or rather I should say, I can already mention this, metalogical properties that such information may possess. And thus, the attempt will be to elucidate in doing so the concept of the self as a quale. Finally, in the 4th part, I will try to show how philosophical views in East and West alike have been formulated with respect to the aforementioned one of the central concepts I mentioned, namely the self in this case. And here I will concentrate on the Buddhist tradition of the so-called no-self theories, the anatta theories, and show how our approach, so the one I want to propose, may also be useful in the empirical investigation with respect to the need for and the underpinning of these philosophical views on mind and consciousness. So I think there is an intimate relation between philosophy and, it's clear, I think, and neurology, neurobiology, whatever you want. So, okay, let me begin by the first part. The first part. In recent discussions in the philosophy of mind, the nature of phenomenal states or qualia, also called raw fields, conscious sensations, or the feel of what it is like to be, and of consciousness in general have been an important focus of research. Well, what are qualia? Some of you will maybe not be familiar with it, but qualia then are properties of mental states as seeing red, feeling pain, and the concept of qualia is sometimes used more broadly to indicate conscious experience in general, because to be conscious is also, of course, a quality. It is something. There is something it is like to be conscious, rather than non-conscious. David Chalmers, a well-known philosopher of mind, writes in this respect: if any problem qualifies as the problem of consciousness, it is this one. In this central sense of consciousness, an organism is conscious if there is something it is like to be that organism. And a mental state is conscious if there is something it is like to be in that state. Sometimes such terms as phenomenal consciousness and qualia, as sort of synonym, are used here. Now, for some people, the question is simple. There are these proponents of mind-body identity theories, as they are called in philosophy. They claim that there is no problem because it's perfectly possible to reduce these mental states and their properties, such as qualia, to neurophysiological properties, that there is no problem at all. For instance, let's take the case of functionalism, another classical theory of in the mind-body theory spectrum. For functionalism, mental states are claimed to be reducible to functional properties or computational properties of the organism concerned. Others, of course, maintain that there still remains what they then call an explanatory gap. So in this sense, the qualia, or consciousness in general, remain to some extent unexplained or unreducible. Both will be discussed, of course. Now, to continue with functionalists, they hold that mental states, qualia, mental states, cognitive states in general, can be viewed as functional states of a machine, or rather, to be a bit more technical, a Turing machine. In this view, functionalist view, the explanation of cognitive functions requires the functions to be or to have a certain causal functional role, that they can be represented by a causal functional description. A mental state in this theory consists of three things: an input, which is a stimulus, then there's a causal interaction of mental state with other mental states, and then there is the output, which is behavioral. So, to put it differently, mental states are defined by what are called job descriptions. Now, this is nothing unusual because reductive explanations in science usually work like this. For instance, it was known that organisms are able to transmit hereditary information. This was known even before the gene was discovered. Subsequent scientific investigations showed that, in fact, DNA was responsible for this transmission, and that therefore that DNA did the job that was required. So, this kind of explanation of mental states in functionalism is underpinned by two extra principles, which are important because they will come back later. And these principles are shared by many functionalists and even some non-functionalists. They are the following. The first one is the so-called principle of mind-body supervenience. Roughly, this says the following: the mental states supervenes on the physical in that any two things, objects, events, organisms, what have you, exactly alike in all physical properties, cannot differ in respect of mental properties. So, in other words, physical indiscriminability entails psychological indiscriminability. Or as it is sometimes put, no mental difference without a physical difference. That's the first principle. It is combined with another principle that is usually called the principle of multiple realizability. And that is, again roughly, that mental states are multiply realizable. Any given mental state can be instantiated in infinitely many physical states. That's why, the idea of computers being able to communicate, not only to communicate, to be intelligent, to be conscious, and so on. Okay, so that's one of the most important contemporary theories on the philosophy of mind, and especially inspired by artificial intelligence and people working there. Now, when we return to our original problem, namely the problem of qualia and consciousness, which I do think they are interchangeable, given that consciousness is some qualia in a sense, functionalism does not believe that qualia can be functionalized. And because of the supervenience principle, they imply, or it follows, what is called in philosophical terms a kind of epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism is the view that every mental event is caused by a physical event, but that mental events themselves have no causal powers of their own. That is important because it comes back in the next part. So that is the idea, epiphenomenalism. So these mental events, qualia, consciousness, are powerless to cause anything else, not even other mental events, and are therefore, one might say, almost literally non-existent, because to be is to be causally active in science in general, you might say. Now, in my view, as will become clear later, I think, language and consciousness are intimately related, and they have, as I have already said a couple of times, a phenomenal or qualia-like aspect. I mean, just there is something it's like to be conscious. Well, there is something also it is like to speak a certain language or to have language competence, linguistic competence. Now, I propose now to go into a little bit more of into the nature of this qualia, and at the same time, you could say, we'll have to say something also about language. Now, this qualia, what I want to show is that qualia do in fact have causal powers. That goes counter some of the theories that are presented nowadays, that they have causal powers and that they therefore are not epiphenomenal, that they have existence in their own right. And that fact comes from the embodiment of consciousness creating the consciousness itself and the qualia that go with it. Okay, so let's have a look there. An initial proposal with respect to the embodiment idea of consciousness can be found in the neurobiological model by Gerald Edelman. I also could have taken Professor Jean's model, but I preferred to take Edelman because he talked quite a lot about this qualia, and that's what I was at the time and still interested in. So, more specifically, there is that theory of neuronal group selection, and where he uses also the concept of a dynamic core. Edelman, to summarize the things a little bit, explicitly aims at constructing a naturalized, that's the title of one of his papers, a naturalized theory of consciousness, in which such things as another concept that comes back later a couple of times, intentionality, namely the property of language and consciousness to be about something, about something in the world, outside. So mental states are characterized by that aboutness, in which then intentionality and qualia, so the subjective raw fields, are accounted for in a neural network. How does he do that? Well, he begins by stressing that though it is sometimes claimed that any attempt to reduce phenomenal or subjective information, so the qualia, to neural activities leads to an explanatory gap, because indeed that might lead to such a gap, that need not be a problem, because he says that the neural systems underlying consciousness arose to enable higher order discriminations in what he calls a multidimensional space of signals, and qualia are those discriminations. So the only function of qualia is to be discriminatory. They have discriminatory function and no meaning in themselves. Now, that's what he also wants to claim. So the qualia in themselves do not have real causal power because they are only discriminatory elements, and they are, but he says, they are informational structures. They arise from the substrate, from the neural substrate, as intermediaries, you might say, as informational structures that allow us to discriminate between the several states. Interesting and important will be already here the notion of an informational state. So it comes back later, as you might have noticed from my talk. So, even if these qualia are not causal, and I would say literally non-existent, it is useful, he says, to talk about them as if they are causal. But we should always be careful about the as-if idea. So there is really nothing more going on than the discriminatory part, and these things are not meaningful or causal in themselves. Therefore, if that is the case, there is no hard problem of consciousness, and there is no explanatory gap. Because, let me quote him again, the need for a phenotype experiencing and giving rise to the qualia is no hindrance for a scientific theory of consciousness. And moreover, If the phenomenal part, so the qualia-like part of conscious experience that constitutes its distinctions, is irreducible, so is the fact that physics has not explained why there is something rather than nothing. Okay, that's clear. Now, another tenet of the theory, which will be useful also, is the idea that the brain really is a massively recursive machine, a massively parallel machine, which is also works recursively. And that's, I'm not going to go into that, but one of the tenets of his theory is the concept of the concept of reentrant signaling between neuronal groups. Be that as it may, what I want to highlight here is that indeed, and I do believe that also, I should say, that the brain, it follows from the theory that the brain is massively recursive, and that is one of its fundamental properties. Now, it should be, because we discussed this one of the earlier talks, it should come as no surprise that language, as a product of the brain, inherits this recursivity. And that is why my question was, and that was remarked by Chomsky, that it is indeed the recursivity that makes us really, that human, let's say, that human language, and by extension also human brain, makes it us really human, at least part of the explanation that could be. Now, such an explanation can also be found in an alternative model to which, about which I will not say too much, which is it has been mentioned a couple of times here already, the model of the complex dynamical systems. The complex dynamical system approach, which is also pretty modern, and what it wants to do, it wants to model neural interactions at lower levels and consequently described by the techniques that are known, the emergence of macroscopic cognitive structures. What is the idea about qualia and consciousness again here then? Well, no problem again, because, I quote just from one of the proponents, namely Klaus Mainzer, from a neurophysiological point of view, the old problem of qualia is, says in my theory, solvable. Qualia are properties that are consciously experienced by a person, and they emerge through the interaction of self-consciousness or bodily interaction of self-conscious organism with their environment, which can be explained via nonlinear dynamics of complex systems. There you go. So again here, the qualia are real, but they do not have any causal powers. However, so they are doomed to causal impotency. In both approaches, the complex dynamical system and the more strictly neuronal approach of Edelman, they are indeed causally impotent. So I think one of the tasks then to do is to show how causal activity can be, in general, I mean, how, it's about the question, how can consciousness be causally active? And qualia are just an illustration of the more general phenomena of consciousness. I think that a lot of it can be accounted, a lot of this, let's say, causal activity can be accounted for through the embodiment. So the idea is that qualia arise from the physical substrate, right? And it is within the, as I will say later, it is through the substrate that they acquire a kind of causality or causal activity. But first, we need to say something else, because it is clear that qualia and, say, consciousness, the least one can say that it arises or emerges from a neural substrate in some sense. Emergence or arising from. Now, here we already have an indication, because, well, there are several ideas about emergence. What is emergence? There's a long-standing theory about what emergent states are that started out long ago by people who were not satisfied by certain concepts in biology and wanted to replace it by emergence with respect to life, for instance. The thinking about causality, about emergence has been going on. And one philosopher, I just mentioned the name Terence Deacon, has proposed a triple kind of emergence. A triple kind of emergence that he thinks is such that in each of these emergence definitions, the phenomena that emerge are still governed by the laws, the regular laws, let's say, by the regular laws of nature, but the effect is that, at least with the third kind of emergence, that they themselves can begin to exert causal power on what lies beneath. So they can have sort of recursive loops. He calls it also recursive causality. So what goes up must come down, but what goes up can indeed come down in that sense also causally. Let me just quote from Deacon's paper there with respect to the third kind of emergence. So he says the following. Third kind, or third order emergence, he says, involves, in addition, with the other two, but never mind, information or memory on some kind of mental states, consciousness, you might say. It is a kind of higher order regularity which can additionally exert a cumulative influence over the entire causal future of the system, thus encompassing the evolution of other processes, lower processes. And that is what he calls recursive causality. It is, he puts it differently also, the level, that third order emergence, where physical causality constitutes significance. And processes he mentions there that are like this are mental activity or also linguistic competence. Now notice that in this case, that's what he wants to stress also, this kind of emergence, this third order emergence, can only arise in information or when the information is physically embodied. So to him and to me also, it is indeed important that the embodiment comes first, since it is through the, in a way to be explained, of course, it's through the embodiment that the information can acquire causal power. And, you know, clinical investigations have been done on this also. And I mentioned just one, namely research by Ewan Thompson and Francisco Varela. They have studied this possibility of there being such a thing as third order emergence and causality that goes with it. Because it's, I mean, I hope you realize this is not normal, right? Causality in science goes up and doesn't come down. So their proposal is to add some kind of causality, which is top-down causality and not bottom-up causality. So it's pretty, to some people it's maybe hard to swallow, but still. Francisco Varela and Thompson have done some investigation, some research in this, and what they claim is that in certain studies, for instance, human epileptic activity, and also the recognition of multi-stable or ambiguous figures, that it might be the subject itself, or him or herself, that voluntarily can influence, for instance, with multi-stable figures, a vase or a face, remember, that it is the activity of the subject itself which determines what it is going to be. Okay, so one can say a lot about this, but if it is true, or if it can be upheld up to a certain sense, up to a certain level, then it is, two things are clear. That qualia, consciousness, can be causally active, and that it can be also, and that's important maybe in this context, scientifically investigated, because now it has acquired a status of being causally active, and then we can do what we do, right? And that is the physical stance again that comes up. What has always wondered me is why people who represent the physical stance still do deny the causal powers to this qualia, but I think we can discuss that. Now, okay. So in principle, no problem with neurobiological investigation, even if we recognize the existence of qualia. Other philosophers who were not satisfied with this have argued that it still should be possible that naturalism or reductionism, the way we want to call it, physicalism, can be combined with the view that consciousness, that somehow leaves consciousness untouched. So not reduced, but still physically somehow inspired, right? It's a strange combination. And these theories are the mysterianist theories. The most important proponent of these theories is the philosopher McGinn. I think Professor Changeux has a little bit of experience with the guy, if I remember well. So but he goes wrong, but in an interesting way. That's why I mentioned him, really. And so what's going on according to McGinn? What is the problem? The problem is, to summarize very quickly, that we do not really know what is going on in the, well, we know what's going on in the brain, but we do not know how the gene of consciousness, that's how he calls it, arises from the neural substrate. That's what he puts. We do not know, but he goes further. So he presents the solution to then the so-called mind-body problem, the relation between mind and body. He calls it mysterianism because it relies on the idea of a mystery, namely a mystery in the sense something is a mystery if if it's a question that the answer of which falls outside of a given creature's cognitive space. Well, that sounds intricate, but it's really simple in a sense. Many of you will know the paper by Thomas Nagel, What is it like to be a bat? Nagel says there also, well, we cannot know what it is to be a bat because we ain't bats. It's impossible. Our cognitive apparatus is not geared toward that, so we can never come to know what it feels like to be a bat. So if bats are qualia, we will never be able to experience them. So that's the idea of cognitive space. But of course, to begin, this is much broader, as we will see. So he starts then in explaining this mysterianism and giving the idea of a mystery from what he calls transcendental naturalism. What is transcendental naturalism? Well, you can see the words naturalism in there, so there is something that has to do with science in there, strangely enough, as immediately see how that can be. So, but it's transcendental. Well, the thing is that, again, the answer to certain questions in science, that's what he really wants to say, is such that we may be, or that the answer to this question may be what he calls epistemically not accessible to us. We cannot ever come to know what an answer to that question is. And that is because we have a certain, what he calls that, cognitive closure. We are cognitively close to certain problems and answers to these problems, among which is the relation then between the mind and the body, or the brain and consciousness. And it goes like this. Can we summarize very quickly what he believes then? First, there is a property, he says, called that P, which is instantiated, or properties, whatever, instantiated in the brain, and these properties, or this property, is the causal basis of consciousness. That's all. Identifying this property or these properties can be done in two ways, namely introspectively or experimentally, empirical study of the brain. Third premise, direct investigation, introspection, cannot identify that property. Fourth premise, empirical study of the brain, that's important, of course, cannot either identify P, therefore P cannot be identified. But wait a minute, later he will modify this a little bit. So, several premises here, of course, each of one may be discussed. But basically it's about the following. Introspection falls out because it's just introspection, because it relies on conceptual analysis or what have you, and that cannot be a reliable basis. But science, empirical study, that's what he means, that's science really, falls also out because of the fact that science is not, it is impossible for science to discover the true nature of something like consciousness. The concepts that are needed, in other words, to explain the causal basis of consciousness are, he says, out of reach of science. But mind you, science, in any case, our science. And why is that? Well, basically, because all our concepts that we use in science are spatial. Spatial, and we use them in such a way, analogically, yes, but consciousness is not spatial. It's an all or nothing thing. So it cannot be, in other words, decomposed also, conceptually. There's another idea of this, what he calls the calm conjecture. As an acronym, combinatorial atomism with law-like mappings. There's an idea he takes from Chomsky, and basically for the linguists here, it's just the principle of compositionality, which we find in natural languages and in logic, which says that the meaning of the whole, is a function of or determined by the meanings of the parts. Frege came up with that idea already long ago. So he says that also for the study of consciousness and for the study of the brain. We cannot, in other words, decompose consciousness and then identify the several subparts to then compose it and to give an explanation in terms of a compositional approach. Okay, so far so good. But there is still that idea that he thinks that there is a scientific explanation of consciousness. There is a thing that is the causal basis, or a property that is the causal basis of consciousness. But what is that thing? Let me rephrase his original premises in the following way. First premise again, there is a property or properties in virtue of which there is a causal basis of consciousness. Now, that property is then a non-spatial causal basis. It should be non-spatial because all other properties are spatial, because our conceptual possibilities do not allow other than these concepts. Thirdly, we are cognitively close to that property, or this property P, or to a theory which contains P, that property. But now it comes. P has a full and non-mysterious explanation in a certain science that is inaccessible to us as a matter of principle. So, on the one hand, he says, we cannot come up with a solution, but there is a science which will exactly give you the causal basis, the causal nexus. And why is that? Basically, because he wants to stick to naturalism. He says, there are no miracles in nature, so it should be possible to solve this problem scientifically. But we have a problem because we have a problem. We have a problem with our science in general. It's close to certain things, let's say. It is then impossible to find a solution. McGinn would say, it is not impossible to find a solution in any science, only it's impossible to find a solution in any science we can come up with. So now there is that property, we cannot come up with it. In other words, and that's a bit technical, what philosophers call the sentence that I just mentioned, that there is such a property that is present in a science that we cannot never come up with, but there is such a science, has what our philosophers call recognition transcendence truth conditions. It is true, but by virtue of what it is true, that does not belong to our recognition capacities. But it is true, right? It's like, you know, somewhere in the universe there is a little green hobbit. Okay, it has recognition transcendent, such a sentence has truth conditions, it's either true or false. But of course, we are not able to go everywhere in the universe to find out whether in fact there is such a hobbit there, right? So, and that will turn out to be the problem with this whole theory, right? So, it has the naturalism in it, but it wants to save consciousness, well, in a sense, by saying that there is no science we can come up with that can ever explain it. But what is my main point here before I move to the next part? The sentence itself, namely, again, that property has a full explanation of properties in a certain science that is inaccessible to us as a matter of principle. Now, this may sound attractive, but it has a certain not very welcome property. As logicians, we know, according to that, not as logicians, but what McGinn says is that it's true. It's just necessarily true that there is some science, only we cannot come up with it because there has to be that explanation. So it is what we call in modal logic a necessary proposition. That proposition, that there is such a science that we can never come up with, but there is that science which has the solution. So it's a necessary proposition. Now, the thing with necessary propositions is, as that's a little bit technical also, if they are true, a necessary proposition, they should be true in what logicians call in all worlds or circumstances, instances that are accessible from our world. So we have to sort of be able to transfer and see whether they are true everywhere, right? But the worlds that we take into consideration, the situations have to be accessible. We have to somehow be able to say something about it. Now, the problem with this sentence is simple. It says that there is such a world, but the world is inaccessible. So, if that proposition is true, it should be true in a world that is by definition not accessible. In other words, it might be false in that world because we can't say anything about it. Now, if the proposition is true, therefore it is false. And therefore this is a contradiction. And therefore, mysterianism cannot be upheld. Well, that's very quick, but anyway, that's the idea anyway. So, the rebuttal of mysterianism is in fact also a logical matter. And it is due, and that's maybe an important moral to draw from this, it is due to a combination in science in general and also in the science of consciousness of several things. Namely, absolutely transcending truth conditions, naturalism, and the cognitive closure concepts, to which one might add, but I won't go into this, the so-called concept of effectively decidable sentence, but never mind. These are the most, so it is impossible to have your cake and eat it the way McGinn wants it. That's not possible. Okay. Now, of course, what he points out, well, I think, is that there might be a hard problem nevertheless, in the following sense. There is, I mean, on the face of it, the existence of what is called an explanatory gap is felt by many people. You cannot really avoid it. And to begin with, it would be not unfair to say that that has to do, it's a consequence of a certain kind of asymmetry in the description of the phenomena. Namely, the description of the difference between what philosophers call the first and the third person perspective. Some phenomena apparently may only be describable from a first person perspective without being reducible to a third person perspective, which is the objective perspective, really. Now, if qualia are real as subjective entities, they could only be, or they maybe could only be described subjectively. And then you have, of course, the question of the reduction of the one to the other. So, some people have concluded from this that asymmetry is real, and then we even have to expect that there is a difference there, which cannot be avoided because of the perspectives. But is this all? No, I don't think so. Maybe something else is to be considered or can be considered. And that something else has to do with, now I come to the idea of information. Again, I mentioned a couple of times already David Chalmers, the philosopher. He came a couple of years ago already, 20 years I think already ago, up with what he called a double aspect theory of information. His hypothesis is that information has two fundamental aspects, a physical one and an experiential or phenomenal one. And it is this and that, furthermore, phenomenal consciousness, so consciousness of qualia or consciousness in general, by virtue of its status, namely its embodiment, is one aspect of information. There is the information present in consciousness is again information that is embodied, and that's what he thinks to be important too. The way he puts it is like this: physically embodied information is a difference that makes a difference. Again. Now, okay, I want to go one step further. That's why I mentioned Chalmers anyway. We have seen now how qualia can be causally active, where they emerge from, that the concept of emergence and causality can be applied to them, and that all of this is not in contradiction to the, let's say, what some philosophers call physical closure of the world. We do not need to appeal to extra laws that are somewhere in the universe to know, to explain or to talk about these qualia. However, what we also stressed is that, and come for Edelman, that these qualia are like informational structures. They have an informational nature. And now I come back to the concept of information, and that will tell us more about qualia themselves, I think. Because, information, there's lots of definitions of information, I won't go into them, but what is an important property, or rather a property that has been discussed a lot, is whether some kinds of information are computable or not. The computability idea of information. Some information is computable, and there are differences in computability. And so this is, I think, a point we should take into account. There is at least three ways in which the relation between information and computability can be viewed or can be looked upon. I will just mention them very quickly. So let us assume that the brain processes information, that consciousness has to do with all of this in some sense. Then our question can be, what kind of information is it that is produced? Is it computable? Yes, or is it not computable? I'm not even going to talk about non-computability, but if you have computability, there are several kinds of computability, let's say. For instance, if you say a system is not computable, so it contains, as I will say in a few minutes, undecidable sentences, the Gödel will come in, then it is uncomputable in a strict logical sense. But there are other senses. A system can be deterministic, but non-linear and chaotic. That means that it implies that the system depends for its outcome on very tiny variations in the initial data, making it practically nearly impossible to predict its behavior. Finally, a system can be stochastic and non-linear, which implies that its behavior can only be predicted probabilistically. I do think that there is some incompleteness going on in the information that is processed through the brain and which gives rise to qualia and to consciousness. And I think it's a first kind of incompleteness or non-computability that we have to take into account. And now I have to say two words about the Gödel theorems. Gödel theorems, very famous. Roger Penrose, for one, deduced from this theorem a whole, sometimes very strange and weird theory about the human capacity and consciousness to see things that are not computable, that are non-recursive also. And Gödel's theorem indeed says there is a true sentence in formalized arithmetic which is such that it is neither provable nor disprovable, but it can be seen to be true. Well, how can that be? That's another question, but that's the point of Gödel's. If you apply that to the whole thing of consciousness, well, Penrose says, well, from that we can see that consciousness can do more than what is said in the machine, as if it were. I'm not going to go into that. What the point I want to raise is a different one, because one can agree with Penrose or not. He has a fantastic idea that he adds there with the non-computable physics and stuff, which makes it a little bit strange to say the least. But maybe the point could be the following. Suppose that information that is processed is incomplete in the logical sense. So there are things in it which are such that they are undecidable, but undecidable. Then I think it's fair to say that the information in some sense will be incomplete for a very simple reason. People can do mathematics, and so they can come up with these informational structures that themselves are undecidable. So it's probably other structures that, or other elements that one can bring forward here to prove the same thing. So it's not going to be the case, I think, that the information process is just straightforwardly decidable in all cases. So the indecidability will be somewhere there present. Now that may be an interesting, philosophically speaking, at least there may be an interesting link between this undecidability and the problem of consciousness and qualia, and also the already mentioned concept of intentionality or aboutness. Because, very quickly, how much time have I got? When did we start? Yeah, I go on for a little while. You see, the thing is that and that is purely logically speaking, if a system is incomplete, think of the Gödel idea of mathematical formulas which are such that they are undecidable but true. That means that there is the information that is captured by the system itself is not fully exhausted, right? There is something more than what the system can say, namely true sentences that cannot be proven in this case. So there is that thing from within the system. There is the idea of there being more than the system itself. There is, in other words, philosophically speaking, then again, a tension in such undecidable systems of an inside and an outside. Namely, it is the system itself that says of itself, I cannot prove X, whatever X is. So there is if you transfer this to consciousness, you could say that it is the felt distinction between the inside and the outside, which could be the representative of the relation between the I and the world, between the self and the world. In other words, to put it differently, suppose all the information that we process would be decidable. In logical terms, this would mean that the system would be categorical. That would be no other possible interpretation that is possible of what comes in, so to say. Then, strictly speaking, that information, I think, would not any longer be about something else. Because aboutness always implies distance, implies distinction between the inside and the outside in the case of the world. About information that is present, but which at the same time says that there is more than that information that is present. So there's a philosophical reason to say that the information that is processed in consciousness cannot really be completely what is called in logic categorical. It should, in some sense, be incomplete. So, right now, what do we have here? The hypothesis could be that given the incompleteness of the information, there is that idea of the inside and the outside, the information that is non-sufficient to capture what it wants to capture, and the system itself, in a sense, knows that there is more. Now, that more is the tension between the inside of call it the mind or the self, and the outside of the world. So we have the structure phenomenologically of a subject here, in and out, object, consciousness of a subject. That's the idea I want to suggest. Now this, I'm moving very quickly, this does not exclude that conscious processes are identified even with brain processes for a very simple reason. All brain processes may be decidable. That's not a point. It's what the information that is produced, that may not be decidable. I mean, compare this to the mathematical situation. If you have mathematical systems, of course, all the numbers and all the formulas that you can write down, they are really, in the sense, you can write them down. That's not the point. It's the interpretation, of course, the information they contain that pertains or that implies the incompleteness. So, analogously, there's no, in that sense, problem of studying brain consciousness scientifically. But it also shows another thing, if I'm right, which I doubt, but anyway, there is when we want to know what consciousness really is, or part of it, we have to look at the information. And the information has certain properties, and it's these properties that make be constitutive of the thing itself, of consciousness itself. That's what I wanted to point out. Now I have 10 minutes or so, I think, 5 minutes maybe, to draw a lesson from this, because that's what I want to do, the fourth part really, with East-West. And, you know, the reference I made, quick, I agree, to Gödel's theorems has certain, as I have already indicated, certain consequences of this for the study of consciousness. One thing being that, and then again, somebody who's people familiar with Gödel's theorem, they know that this implies what is called arithmetization, a process by means mathematics speaks or talks about itself. So reflexivity. Systems that are reflexive have that property of being complete, most of them in any case. Now, notice that is the point. What we tend to think is that, of course, consciousness is also reflexive. When we talk about the self is a kind of self or reflexive consciousness going back to itself, self-consciousness. And it is in this respect that I want to quote a recent paper by Professor De Haan and Jean Jeu, the 2011 paper in Neuron. At the end of it, the final part really. Let me quickly quote the following. For Damasio, they mentioned Damasio and Meyer, core consciousness of incoming sensory information requires integrating it with a sense of self, between brackets, the specific subjective point of view of the perceiving organism. That is what I would call a quale. That's a self. But there is more apparently that is needed, as you mentioned, namely something like higher order thoughts. A higher order thoughts, and I quote, coding for the very fact that the information or that the organism is currently representing a piece of information is needed, and that is what is called, for the information to be conscious, metacognition. So there is metacognition and there is a self. There's two things. Now, okay, 2 minutes. What is this sounds nice. And I hope and I think that both of these will have neural representations. But now let's have a look now at, not philosophically, not at the Western traditions, but at other traditions, namely Eastern tradition. Consider the case of Buddhism. Buddhism, at least some Buddhist schools, many Buddhist schools, I mean, many Theravada schools or Hinayana schools do have this, and many Mahayana schools do also have this. What do they have? Well, they just say consciousness, there is no self, and consciousness is not reflexive. There is no such thing as a self, and that is because, or rather, consciousness itself is not a reflexive property. So, let me summarize. There's three premises. Subjectivity requires a subject or a self. That's the first premise, that's Buddhist style. Secondly, there is no self. Thirdly, consciousness is irreflexive. So, what we connect in Western traditions very much is two things. Does subjectivity require a self or a subject? Yes. And is consciousness intrinsically reflexive? Yes. Now here, these things are taken apart. They say, no, if there is no self, consciousness is not reflexive, and we don't need a self. Well, but still we have that idea of consciousness. How do we know consciousness in the Buddhist style? Well, they would say, we know it not through direct cognition, as we know, for instance, the self being conscious, but through inference. Now, inference is very different from direct cognition. Inference is an argument, is abductive. We have reason to say something exists, therefore we say that it exists. Now, what they suggest is that consciousness is ontologically non-existent, but we infer it as a construction from the things we do and think. Now, here's the point. If it is true that there is a self, and it is true that there is metacognition, it would be interesting to see neurologically whether the Buddhist style argument would show that there is no self, neurologically speaking, and would furthermore show that if we can find patterns that represent neurologically abductive inferences or inferences in general, then we can come to kind of a conclusion with respect to what is there a self, is there no self, on a basis that is more or less neurological. Now that would be interesting, wouldn't it, to investigate? I think here too. Well, so let me end with a quote, or rather a variation of a quote, if I can still find it, a quote from Churchill with respect to consciousness. Haha. But it's not about consciousness, but okay. It's a quote on Russia. Some of you might know. Famous Russia quote. You know how it goes? Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. Remember that one? Dates from the 50s, but okay. Consciousness is a riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. I would say we have probably gone past the mystery, but mysterianism, no go, by now, which leaves us to tackle the riddle and the enigma. But optimism is a moral duty. Thank you.
Well,
have fun. Okay.
questions.
So, were you conscious when you gave this talk?
Are you asking what I was smoking before?
No. Well, how would you prove that you were conscious when you gave the talk?
Well, okay. The point is that being conscious is not something that we prove, because proving is inference. That's what we do in mathematics. Oh, sorry.
You can say that you can talk about what you said.
Sure.
That's not argument.
Well, or you can answer me
But
another
maybe you
way.
should continue with your question. But
No. So it would be very nice to have a definition of consciousness to start with, and perhaps all the other difficult concepts like states,
Yes, mental
informational states,
Yeah, I know.
embodiment.
Yes.
Yes.
All that.
No space-time for consciousness.
Oh, that's Bagin's idea, right? I don't agree with it, but anyway,
Okay,
I
yeah.
couldn't go into that. No. It's not proven that consciousness is non-spatial, but there are some reasons to put it like that. But anyway.
Yeah, so I have a little bit of trouble understanding, say, informational states, and what information actually. You're talking about information, but information is measured in bits.
I know.
So how many bits?
That's a little bit too difficult. But if you want an informational theory, Tononi's theory, Tononi.
Yeah, well.
Well, okay, well, if that says more about information than I can do, I guess. But okay, well, never mind.
Yes, so I was just bewildered. So could you tell me what is an informational state and what is a state in your opinion? Why are mental states different from informational states and other states? What is a state?
I'm not saying that they are different, right? Think of functionalism, right? Functionalism is a classical theory. It's not of my invention. Of course, mental states are functional states. So what is a functional state? Well, it's a state of a machine. It's a machine state.
Okay, so it's not it's a physical state?
I think it should be physically embodied to be really, to have something to do with consciousness. Well, yeah.
Then we have it again, embodied. What is embodied? We are not talking that Jesus is coming again here, or...
Well, that would be fun. But,
yeah, but what is that is embodied?
In the flesh. Okay, well.
In what?
No, that means in a biological structure, maybe.
What is out there that is not biological structure?
The information, of course, that's what functionalists claim. There is a difference between the hardware and the software, right? That's their idea. And I don't agree there. So, but are we going to say that there is no more hardware then?
These are analogies, and they don't explain anything. Because the analogies are not explanations, right?
Well, one is an explanation, a real explanation. I agree there, right? But analogies they can be instructive. Well, in science, there are.
They can also be seductive.
Yeah, but you know. Sorry?
They come from shared consciousness. The analogy, if it's the whole, is a shared apprehended experience.
That's true.
What's happening is that we are in a state. You and I and the people in this room are in a state. The state of apprehension, where we are sharing the experience. It's physical, it's emotional, it's spatial, and it's a conscious expression. Outside this room, it may not be the same. The people outside this room are not sharing that state. We are embodying a philosophical impulse, as he's described it. I mean, I'm still bewildered, as you say, because I've gone through this, and I think, how in the hell did anybody follow all the arguments? Honestly, there was no representation on that screen. So the only way I could stay with this thing was to make notes as I was going along and try and hold the narrative in my mind. And I don't know how many of you are at that point where you could hold the narrative beyond 10 sentences. Okay, but as I wrote it down, I began to collectively sense, because of my analogous experiences with the references that he made, I began to make sense of it. That's what was going on in my mind. I don't know what the rest of you were doing, but that's what I was trying to do. So in a sense, I felt I was an embodied part of this mental excursion to try and define what we could understand about neural substrates informing the qualia. And the first thing I wanted to do was say, what in God's name can you spell qualia for me, mate? Because I need that.
Q-U-A-L-E. No, sorry.
A Q-U-A-L-I-A, right?
No, Q-U-A-L-E.
So the first time I've ever heard qualia. And so I was constantly trying to reference this thinking, oh, he means consciousness. Okay. So anyway, it's quite an interesting experience.
Yeah, well, okay. But qualia is the idea of the subjectivity, really, in experience. The feeling of pain is different from the feeling of a tickle. The seeing of red is different from the seeing of blue or whatever. That's the specific subjective experience. That's quali. The thusness in Latin, quale, means thus. Yeah. So, yeah. So there is something it is like to see green, right? Yeah, well, okay. Some people would say no, I would say, well, you know. But there's another thing I want to ask you. Since you were talking about explanations and analogies, all right. But come to think of it, when you call something an explanation, right? When the moment of correlation even, when you go further than correlation, models are the only things we have, don't we? It is you, yeah. It's the only things we have, concepts, right? That's what we can do. And what are concepts? Well, there are some kinds of analogies too. I'm not saying that there is no distinction between the concepts that we can use and the models we have. But there is no way to confuse, I mean, it's not always useful to confuse model with reality. Huh? When is a model real? It's real. When does it? Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes. But there is a leap from. Say that again? Mm-hmm. And it is another, yeah.
Of the state, and you could use it, but you choose not to. So why?
But no, well, because I'm not working with it, but if you consider functionalism, that's a classical theory. Well, yeah. Then the use of this concept is in any case widespread, right? And incidentally, I wouldn't know how to do it differently. Well, I could talk about other concepts then, instead of state. Maybe we should talk about this in a few minutes, yes. Yes.
No, I just want to, I first want to appreciate the attempt you have made to
Thank you.
give credit to all the different theories and views. But I must say, perhaps at this stage, some of these views and theories are becoming obsolete, but I agree with you that one should say why.
Yeah.
And just to answer the question that Per asked, and what is our aim as neuroscientists, I think, which is after all why we are here, and try to approach the issue of consciousness in general, and more specifically, as we did with Stanislas, conscious access, which is much more limited. And I think what we, all of us in the field, try to do is to try to find objective measurement of subjective phenomena. That's it. And it's in a few words, you know, so you ask a subject, what does he see, what does he feel, you give a report, and under this condition, you may consider that there is some reliability in the prospective report. And I saw the word lion, I saw the word exit. I heard about your talk. I remember the question, so if you repeat if I was sleeping, I would not remember. But
Maybe you would.
Here are sleeping, but in our case, we are not. So there are some really objective criteria, and I think the research in the field now is certainly to try to find accurate kind of measurements or way to establish this relationship between subjective and objective. So that's
so the question.
One
Yes.
question for me, which is a very practical one, and which in fact let us detach from, I would say, some kind of philosophical debate. We are going to be, I'm sorry to say
No, it's okay.
it's a philosophical position.
Right, that's what I was going to be my answer, right?
But at least we may progress in the field and by doing that.
Yes.
Now, there was also some question I wanted to ask you about the use of some words which are important, and the notion of information is very important. And there, perhaps you may clarify this issue. I don't know, because the information theory came from Shannon.
Yeah.
And the Shannon view of communication through, let's say, a wire from a speaker and a receiver is something which has been challenged now. You know. And you know that you cannot equate the information content to only what's being transported through the channel. Yeah. And sometimes you have just one word, hey, and everybody is moved. And the information content is almost negligible. And nevertheless, the meaning is intense. And these views have been developed by Grice and Sperber, as you may know.
Dan Sperber, yes.
And Dan Sperber in particular, with the relevance in the
relevance
sense
theory.
that in the subject which is receiving a message, the consequence in the brain might be very different according to the context of this. So that's the perhaps
So you would say that.
kind of debate we may have in the future
Okay.
on the use of the word information
Yeah.
and the
Well.
meaning or content of meaning.
Okay,
And so on.
I agree there, but
So
on the
this is one thing. And last, I think the definition you gave of incompleteness or
Yes.
is very questionable, I think, at this stage. Because
Yes.
one thing that is very important for us is to be aware that we don't know very much.
okay. No.
Has nothing to do with making a complete reasoning, but you know that we should be under conditions where, in fact, having a very limited knowledge, we have to deal with that, and we are not able to give rational answers to any kind of situation where we are. So we have to be very humble as experimentalists in this field. But nevertheless, I think we have a future, I hope, in trying to really look for, I don't use the word correlate because I don't like it. What I would like to say is the actual basis or processing or mechanism or whatever.
Okay.
Because correlate has not the notion of causality. And we, in fact, want to have experiments with lead us to some form of causality.
Oh yes, that's not only correlation but also causality. That's absolutely. Yeah. So just one answer really. When you said about the incompleteness, I mean, I think I was correct with respect to the mathematical aspects. That the application, is that what you mean? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So maybe I'm not sure whether I'm going to answer your question here, but you're in the beginning. What you said is what I would say is, of course. But the thing is, that's what also that many philosophers, at least, well, I do, feel there is a first person and third person perspective, and you can. I mean, it's difficult to get rid of it because reducing the one to the other implies that science doesn't deal in these concepts, right? Okay.
I think in the new reflections that we may have now about consciousness is that we should avoid to deal with consciousness on a single person.
Okay.
And I think we have to deal with theories of consciousness between people. And in particular, if you want to go into
the social aspect.
That's exactly, you said the word before
A good
me.
suggestion. So, we've work to do.
If you
We've work to do, yeah.
if
You're
you
right,
want
you're right.
to enter into the social interaction, you need to have some theory of consciousness which involves the partnership, which is, I may say, very characteristic of the human.
So indeed, my view is rather individualistic, right? When I look at consciousness, but
we
you're
have been, as neuroscientists, too much concerned with
also.
the individual.
Yeah, sure. As philosophers, we also say that. Yeah.
Okay, I think he came here to provoke us, and this is good.
No,
So
I came here because
we
it's
will
fun.
counter-provoke. No, it's great. But the question is, do these questions actually help? Because these questions have been going around, and issues have been going around since the 50s and even earlier, till David Marr came and says, these questions are irrelevant. He says, if we want to understand the brain, we should treat the brain as something that has some problems to solve and see what is the computations that underlie this. So the question is why does the brain as an evolutionary mechanism needs qualia, and even do we need consciousness?
Ooh.
So,
but that already implies that there are qualia, right? So you get okay, that's fine.
Yeah,
with me
because
already now.
the
We're in business.
No, the issue is this, that we need to. These questions have dragged and have created problems in neuroscience. We need to solve specific problems, correct?
Yeah.
Not very general theoretical problems. And that's what David Marr said. And when he said that, he really set free neuroscience.
He was? He what? I did.
He set neuroscience free. So, Yeah, because till then we were bound
if
to,
you want
to
to
questions like
Okay.
that.
But that's a more general problem. If you want to declare certain questions off limits, go ahead. I mean, yeah. I've always learned in philosophy that the most important part are not the answers, but the questions.
Correct. But are these questions?
So,
Yeah.
putting certain questions off limits is maybe not the best way to go about. You could say, well, from a practical point of view, we don't need these questions. Well, you never know, you know?
Could qualia help in making consciousness computational?
No. No, I didn't talk about that, but no, that's another thing, no. No, but that's okay, no? Should everything be computable? No, well, okay. But this is a really different topic, but I don't want to go into this because then we're going to fight a little bit. But
No, I don't want to fight.
no.
May I? Well,
You know, it's just one word. Philosophically, it helps to elucidate what it is to be a subject. That's, as a philosopher, I'm interested in that, but okay.
and one word. Oh, I'm here.
Oh, you're there.
That's very much interesting. And one word you use without definition is causality. And wait.
No,
And at the end, you came to the Buddhism,
Yes.
meditation. And I think there is a
That was
point.
interesting, no?
There is a point. I'm very sympathetic to the Pearl's question, and because he's keeping asking what,
Yeah. Well,
and definition, and start from defining what, which is element, and to explain it is the Western way of science, which we are heavily trained with. And one way of explanation, which we are very comfortable, is causality.
mhm.
And I think that's a Western way of thinking. And
Oh, no. Well, yes and no. I mean, just one thing, just one remark
okay.
before I continue. With the self, right, I said, well, in the Western edition, but it's not completely true. When you look at the philosopher Hume, he doesn't believe in the self either.
well,
Our contemporary Derek Parfit as a philosopher, and the same with causality, right? Hume doesn't believe in
yeah,
causality.
I know there's some exception or
There's
variations, but in the very end of your talk, you come out with this Buddhism
With what? Yes.
Buddhism explanation.
Yes, that sounds
And,
like, yeah.
Zen meditation, one goal of Zen meditation is get free from causal constraints and accept the thing as it is. And this is not just, Zen is just a small fragment of the Japanese Buddhism school.
Yes.
But if you look into the more original sutra, like a Lotus Sutra, they all explain about this.
Which sutra you mean?
A Lotus Sutra?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's just an example. So this is one primitive
The original sutra is the Anatalakana Sutra, from
yeah,
Pali
but
Canon.
including that, they
Okay,
all
well.
expect you through the meditation, whatever
Yeah,
training,
okay.
to accept as it is without explanation of causality. And not everything are causal. And our instinct is to accept the causality out of, maybe no causality. So the question here is that in starting from what or definition and explain with the causality, that's could be applied in a very strong way to the materialistic world.
Sure.
And in a consciousness or spirits or introspection, there's no materials or no object to be explained. And the way that this holistic or what is Zen or whatever Buddhist way of thinking is to start from just accepting as it is,
Mhm.
without any definition, with no causality. And then through the meditation or thinking and training, they arrives to the definition in the last.
Nobody knows what causality is.
Nobody knows. So,
No,
so,
no,
so,
no.
so that
I'm not
that is
believing
a
anything.
that is a point.
Not even here.
My
not even.
last comment is that we need both, and both have shortcomings and advantages. And that I think to study the consciousness or human mind or cognition, we need both approaches, not to be constrained by the one or the other.
Yeah, well, yeah. Okay, yeah, I agree there, but I thought the question about the self, for instance, and the neural base or whatever, I mean, there is some kind of a decision procedure. It might be. That's why I think it's an interesting...
It is interesting. And
Okay.
it's a
It's
interesting
not just
subject.
only a description of something. There is maybe more that we can explain there then through east-west comparisons then. On
And
neural.
we need east-west connections, and we need both. And
Yeah, right. We need everything. Il faut du
It's
tout
not
pour faire un
compromising.
monde, they say in French.
Compromising. but
Il
I-
faut du tout pour faire un monde. No, just kidding.
Just to remember that many of these philosophies, from Democritus to Confucius and Buddha, have been proposed 500 years ago, and 5,000 years ago. Well, when was it? 3,000, 2,500 years ago. So I'm sorry for that one, because we have to count either from us or from Christ, whatever. And therefore, I don't think we have to anticipate that they have exhausted all our thinking today. And what is actually very attractive in the small vehicle, the early Buddhism, it is one of the most...
The Hinayana, the small vehicle, yes.
Yes, it is one of the most materialistic kind of philosophy which existed.
It reduces consciousness to indirect inference. Yes.
Yes, so it's very close. The early,
it's reductionist.
Early words of Buddha were along this line, according to the tradition. So, but I am not going to talk about Buddhism.
No.
it's I discipline. Just to come back to Maar, because he's a very distinguished computer scientist and so on.
I know.
And I think the computability.
Was he not Russian?
No,
he was not.
British. Yeah.
Russian descent? I would suspect. But okay.
Maybe, whatever, Russian or not.
No,
the issue which we are all concerned is the issue of computability of models of consciousness. And I think when we wrote our review with Stanislas, we used the word consciousness. And referee, I don't know if he was from Maar School, said, I am not going to let this paper be published if you keep the word consciousness.
Right. So there you have your answer.
No, but the answer is very nice, because we eliminated the word consciousness and did not change anything to the paper. So in the sense that we use instead conscious processing versus non-conscious.
Conscious access.
And conscious access and things like that, which limit the meaning of the word consciousness.
Yes.
And I think the word consciousness has so many meanings, both in philosophy, in theology, these things, that this is the reason why it is not recommended to use this as such, to explain consciousness.
Right.
I think this is something which I found extremely difficult to accept. But on the other hand, we hope, and they have already been done, to have some models for, let's say, conscious processing of visual stimuli. And in the vision problem, to have access from non-conscious to conscious vision, and try to evaluate in neurobiological terms the difference, and describe them as computational models.
Yes.
So I would say that there is no opposition in studying, let's say, conscious access or conscious processing or limited aspect of consciousness, which satisfy issue. I don't see any objection to study this. On the opposite, I would suggest that this is a field for research in the future.
Absolutely. So one thing I want to ask you then, what you think, you talk about access consciousness, but Ned Block once introduced the distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Does your distinction have to do with that? Yeah. Okay, well. I was just wondering.
But we, at this stage in the field, at least the way I look at it and approach it, is to limit as much as we can the experimental paradigm that we are going to use, and which are, of course, related to so-called consciousness in a large sense. Yes. And the more we restrict the experimental paradigm, the best we are to find the relationship between objective and subjective processes, and to build computational model for them. There is no reason why we should not.
But maybe you should forgive the philosophers for being wild a little bit at times. I mean, me. Okay.
I would love to have many more questions myself also, but I think unfortunately we have to stop here because we have a final 25-minute session in which I ask, one more applause.